started video games with Pong. Quite frankly, dropping in quarters, missing the little bouncing ball. I went from Pong to all the ones that followed. Pac-Man, and then up to Popeye and Donkey Kong and all of that stuff. And as soon as they were available on Atari and ColecoVision and all of that, I bought all of those things. Played Castle Wolfenstein and Doom on the computer. Someplace in the 90s I got out of it for a while because I found the games were just shouting a lot, and they weren't intriguing like the earlier games that seemed to be more, let's get past it. We're going to save the cities in Missile Command. We're going to destroy the asteroids, all of that sort of stuff. Then I came back, I guess, when the PlayStation and Xbox came out, the first of both of those, and suddenly there were stories as well as really interesting games like Portal and such. I enjoy playing the most actually on the PS3. All of them are good. I have all of them, though I finally did get the dreaded red circle of death just the last few weeks ago. But I like the PS3 controller. It just fits my hand better, and I don't tire out as much. So it's not the games are any better or any worse, though there are more exclusive games on the PS3 that I like, from God of War and Uncharted and things like that, that you can't get elsewhere. But I'd say that's the reason primarily, is the controller itself. When the PS2 came out and then the PS3, which smoothed it just a little bit more, it just felt right in your hand, and therefore it was easy to play for longer times. Well, they're very different in that the original games, I think, were really clever, somewhat brilliant. The original games were much more puzzle-driven, in that if you had a game like Pac-Man, you had to actually figure out your paths. You had to figure out how to move things. It was very clear, simple. You knew exactly what you had to do. All the games from Pac-Man to Missile Command to all of those were very simple. You could understand the game in 5 seconds. You may not be able to master it. In fact, you can't possibly master it. But they were very, very simple games. As games got more complex, the story started to take over. It's very much like, in my mind, early films. When you saw the Lumiere brother films, it shocked people to see a train coming into a station, and that was the entire film. And people would run out of the theater in the very beginning because they didn't, never having seen a movie before, they thought a train was actually coming at them. But then you got the one-reelers, then you got the two-reelers, and they started to do more complex stories. It's exactly the same with games. Now the games may not be instantly understandable because you have to dig deep into it, but now you're starting to get stories that have a lot of depth to it. So it's a completely different experience. I love going back and forth. I love playing the simple games that are now more likely on your iPhone or your iPad. Angry Birds is a really perfect example of a retro type game, only with today's graphics. Simple concept, and you go from there. But I also absolutely love the story-driven games. As I say, I really love being able to go back and forth. If I'm sitting here and I'm waiting for something to happen, usually my iPhone's open and I'm playing a game of some sort, whether it's a word game or just a quick puzzle game or something of that. If I'm home, I want to actually immerse myself, because one of the pleasures for me of gaming is, unlike watching TV or even reading a book, my mind drifts on those. When I'm playing a game, if I don't want to die, I got to have totally concentrate, which means my mind is off of every other problem in the world. I'm not thinking about anything else. I'm thinking about, how am I going to get to the next place? How am I going to get around the demons? How am I going to race the car in the correct direction? And so I like them both. There's no one type of game I like. I love going back and forth between them. I don't think it makes any difference to me if it's a simple, straightforward Angry Birds, Pac-Man type game, or if it's Diablo, or if it's Uncharted or Portal. I like a game that has a point to it. The more difficult type games, or as simple as an Angry Birds. Well, all my career I've been a comic book writer. Started back in the late 60s as a comic book writer. I still write comics to this day. Created characters like Blade, who have turned into several movies, the Teen Titans, or Bullseye, Black Cat, 1,000 different characters for DC and Marvel and other places. Whenever Superman Returns came out, I and another writer who was a friend of mine named Flint Dilley, who's also a game writer, were asked to work on the Superman game. They had a game already done, but they wanted us to come in and sort of fix it in some degrees. It's hard for me to explain exactly what we had to do, but the game was already done. So the two of us got in there, and that was the first time I wrote a video game that I was involved. I had always played them, as I say, but I didn't know that they could be written. Because as far as I knew, they were always written in-house by the programmers or by a director or somebody like that, not an outside source. This was the first time for me I was asked to participate in it. And Flint was the expert in gaming, game writing, and he really helped me learn how to do the technical parts of the writing. I knew how to write, I mean, that wasn't a problem, and I knew games. So that wasn't the problem, but there are technical things you do when you're writing a game, whether it's writing in the Excel sheets or if you're writing in branching areas. Those are all technical, and you don't know those automatically. From there, I started to be picked up by other places, and I've been now doing game writing for about 8 years. I do a lot of teaching of writing at various places, and I get the question, what's the difference between comic book writing, animation writing, and video game writing? The simple answer is they're all story-driven, but they're all told from a different point of view. Comic book writing is still pictures, and you're writing to sort of propel people from one still picture to the next still picture, and you're also encouraging them to fill in the gap between the pictures in the way you can construct your stories. Animation writing is constant movement. So you actually have to think when you're writing, how long will it take for a character to walk from one side of the room to the next, and how much dialogue can they say in the interim? If you have too much dialogue, they're going to be facing the wall and just talking, and it's going to be boring as anything. Game writing isn't always linear. The beauty of game writing, and the thing that actually I find interesting, is every game is different, but they're not always a linear process. When I'm writing a comic book story or when I'm writing a novel or an animation script, it's always linear. You start at the beginning, you go to the middle, to the end. Game writing, you're writing in sequence. You may not even be writing for a story to be told in one fell swoop. It's not in one cinematic. You may be planting a clue here. If you're writing a MMO, you're peppering the story, you're peppering information throughout the entire world so that no matter where the person goes, they'll pick up the information you want them to get. So it starts training you to think in a completely different fashion than we're trained since we were born. We're always trained to think linearly. And I find that when I write video games, it actually helps all my other writing because it frees the mind up and it takes you away from writing by rote. But games you can't, because every single game is different. And they're never in a pure linear fashion. And I've written games purely on Excel sheets in no order that I even know where it fits into the game. I just get a phone call saying we need this sequence done here, and this may be 3/4 of the way through the game, and I have to try and keep it in my head. Okay, this takes place before or after this sequence. After? Okay, fine, now I know what the emotional core of that particular story is. In other games, I may have come up with the plot. So everyone is a very, very different experience, and I really love it for that because, as I say, it forces you to keep on your game, and it forces you to rethink. Whereas sometimes doing the same thing, you just, well, I know how to do that, type, 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 here's the dialogue, goodbye. But you can't do that with games. In video games, Flint Dilley certainly was the one who taught me the technical aspects of that stuff, and I knew Flint. We were both story editors on Transformers cartoon show So I knew him for 15 years before we even did that, and I've known him ever since as well. But I don't know if I had a specific mentor in my career. I had different ones along the line. I had Flint, as I say, on video games who helped me. Steve Gerber is the one who brought me into animation. He was the creator of Howard the Duck, and I worked with him at Marvel Comics prior to that. And so we were good friends, and he just asked me if I'd be interested in doing a G.I. Joe. And from there, I just kept doing more and more animation. In comics, I can't think of any one person. I learned from reading the comics that I liked and learned from how stories were put together. So Stan Lee, because I worked as Stan's editor-in-chief at Marvel, he was a really strong person in charge, and he knew exactly what he wanted, and he did explain things, but he had already been a professional. So I don't know if he's a mentor or somebody who came along and said, no, do this. But he was great. He was phenomenal. I have great admiration for Stan, and we worked together for 8 years. I don't know that all the people, but certainly I know that Bushnell did all the early ones, and certainly the Atari material that I bought. So I would have to say him, because I think he did Pong too. Everything else developed, but each person adds their own. I don't know all the people who did it. I don't know, 90% of who created what game. I could tell you much more today, but even there I'd have problems because now it's handled very differently. But I guess Noel Bushnell is probably the father of it, and then he went on to do Chuck E. Cheese, so I guess you can go from really good video games to very bad pizza. Storytelling in video games is really leading the player to finding elements of a story, and story is told mostly through cinematic, which I think needs to change somewhat. Cinematic is great for the sequences where you can't do it through gameplay. I try, when possible, to put a lot of storytelling in voiceover. I wrote the Dark Knight game. It never came out, unfortunately, because it was never finished through a company in Australia. And one of the things that I tried to do on that game is put a radio in Batman's ear things, because they have to be there for some reason. And that way, Commissioner Gordon or Alfred or whoever else could speak directly to him. And there could be conversations while he was doing something else. So there could be some warnings. There could be all ways of having to avoid just cutting to a cutaway cinematic. The cinematics were used to tell a different type of story in my mind. I wrote the Green Lantern game, and that was built in to his ring. That is, he can communicate through his ring. So I again did the voices and as much information as he was going from one place to another. So you were still playing the game while you were getting information, and you didn't feel that you were just cutting away to something else. Cinematics are vital to tell the type of story that you simply cannot do in-game. They can tell you a lot about the character. They can tell you a lot about where you're going to go. They could warn you. They could develop, as in, say, God of War or Diablo or Uncharted. They can really create the characters in a stronger way than you can on any in-game type of dialogue. That's the strength of a video game compared to everything else. You have to find ways. It's the strength and the weakness. You have to find ways to tell this information in a completely different fashion. In a movie, you could just have a two-shot and people are talking. That's about the most boring thing in the world to do in a video game, because you want to play. So you want to get in there, you want to get out of that type of mode as fast as possible, but you need the cinematics to tell the story in a way that can't be done any other way. So you have to be real careful, but you have to know what you're doing. And I think God of War, Uncharted, and most of the Blizzard games really handle the cinematics beautifully. Well, I think I actually answered it. My love for video games is simply that when I'm playing it, my mind is totally there. I'm not concerned about my problems. I'm not concerned about what else I'm going to have to do. I'm just there in the moment, enjoying myself, trying to figure out some trick, trying to figure out my strategy, trying to figure out what I'm doing in the game, and all the real world concerns are gone because you have to concentrate. Otherwise, you're dead. Literally in the game. But there's no other medium like that because even if I'm reading a novel, my mind drifts. And it could be the best novel, I could be loving it, but at some point my mind's going to drift a little bit. So video games for me is a way of just total relaxation and getting out of the world and just being by myself and enjoying the moment. And you don't get enough of that these days because wherever you go, you're being assaulted by noise and you're being assaulted by 1,000 things, and sometimes it's nice to just be you and the one thing you're doing and nothing else is around you whatsoever.